Hello and welcome everyone to the 2021 virtual edition of Words, London's Literary and Creative Arts Festival. I'm Joshua Lambier, the Artistic Director of the festival, and I'm coming to you live from Western University. As we all gather today virtually, weathering what we hope will be the final months of this pandemic, I want to situate us on the territory on which I'm zooming to you right now. London is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Attawandaron peoples on lands connected to the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and water and as vital contributors to our community and to the Words Festival. I'm currently in University College, not too far from Deshkanzibi, also known as the Thames or Antler River, which is flowing fast and is quite swollen from weekend rain in London, Ontario. It's my privilege to have the opportunity to host tonight's distinguished guest, Wayne Johnston, who will be joining us to talk about his new novel, The Mystery of Right and Wrong, a haunting and breathtaking novel that grapples with sexual abuse, violence, racism, and resilience, as well as the psychic toll of long silenced and then ultimately unearthed family secrets. The Words Festival is coming to you to the safety of, and comfort of home to bring the brightest writers who are tackling issues of pressing concern, making us laugh, commiserating with human sorrow, and confronting big ideas. I will offer an advanced warning for our audience joining us tonight that our conversation will involve stories of sexual abuse and family violence. It is a powerful, haunting novel inspired by real events in Wayne's personal life, a book that he and his family have come to call the book, which is to say a foundational book of his writing life. It's a story about how a traumatic event in our lives, and I imagine many of you at home can relate to this experience or know somebody who can, that tears into the fabric of our lives and marks a new kind of time, a new division of time in our lives, before the event happens and after the event happens. Over the next hour or so, we're going to engage with Wayne's new book and his work, and we're going to take your questions in chat and on the webinar's Q&A function. So send along your thoughts, questions, and cogitations to join the discussion as we go along. I will be here to bring those questions out of the chat and Q&A and to share them with Wayne. I would also like to recognize the generous support of the Ontario Arts Council, the London Arts Council, and the Faculty of Arts and Humanities. Financial supports that allow us to keep this festival free. That's right, everything this month of the festival is free during what we hope will be the waning months of the pandemic. My warm thanks to Museum London and all of our community partners. We couldn't deliver the Words Festival without you. Our distinguished guest tonight, Wayne Johnston, is someone I and many others regard as one of Canada's finest writers. Beginning his career as a reporter at the St. John's Daily News, he published his first novel, The Story of Bobby O'Malley, in 1985, which won W.H. Smith Books in Canada First Novel Award. With the publication of his breakthrough novel, The Colony of Unrequited Dreams, in 1999, he received critical acclaim for telling the epic story of Newfoundland's complicated history and a fictionalized depiction of Joey Smallwood's contentious efforts to bring Newfoundland kicking and screaming into the 20th century, to use his famous words. His novels have won numerous awards, and his memoir, Baltimore's Mansion, won the Charles Taylor Prize. Wayne Johnston, welcome back to the Words Festival.
Thanks, nice to be here.
Great. So maybe we could start tonight, and it'd be an odd for some out there to hear this, to start by beginning at the end or the afterword, the author's note. In my opening remarks, I noted that this is a story sparked by an event in your life, in the life of your family, that marked a new division of time before the visit and after the visit. I imagine you've had a chance to talk about this particular evening a lot as the book has come out, but I think it's really important to establish our footing and our bearing in the story. Could you tell us about that fateful night in the fall of 1987?
Yeah, it was actually about mid-afternoon, but November in Newfoundland by mid-afternoon is almost night. Yeah, my wife and I, Rose, had moved back from New Brunswick, where we had both been students at the University of New Brunswick, moved back to St. John's. This was after I had written the story of Bobby O'Malley. I kind of was um, it was kind of strange. While I was a student at UNB, I wrote the story of Bobby O'Malley as my thesis, and it got published and won some prizes, et cetera. But I was still a student because I started a PhD program. Uh, but I eventually dropped out because it looked like the writing was starting to pay off. uh, I was, and the PhD was kind of my safety net. We moved back to St. John's. We'd only been back for about a month. We were still kind of getting our footing, reconnecting with friends, et cetera, et cetera. And I was working on my second book. And Rose was out teaching at the university. She had a lectureship at the university, Memorial University. And I was in my study in this apartment that we had just rented. And I didn't even know we had a doorbell, but the doorbell rang, and I decided to ignore it. But it rang again, kind of insistently. So I went downstairs to the ground floor, opened the door to find a young man about my age, 27 years old, standing there. I didn't know who it was. I'd never seen him before. Tears were streaming down his face. Um, I thought he might have been in a car accident or something and was just sort of randomly seeking help. That wasn't the case. He introduced himself as my brother-in-law. He had just married my Rose's sister, and I didn't know him. I knew about the marriage, but it had happened before we got to St. John's. And he said, "There's something I think you should know, and it's going to take a while to tell you." And I still didn't feel any sense of dread or anything like that because I didn't know the guy. So I said, "Okay, if you want to come in." I was actually kind of annoyed because I was, my writing had been interrupted. But he kind of brushed past me and ran up the stairs as if, the place was his, not mine. And I followed him up the stairs thinking, what the hell is this? What
Right,
is going on?
right.
We sat in the front room of the apartment, and for the next couple of hours, while he smoked cigarettes, chain smoking, and continued to cry, he told me this story that, as in your introduction, you said, pretty much, well, definitely, uh, changed my life forever. The telling of it changed Rose's too, although everything he said was about what had happened to Rose and her three sisters. Specifically, it was everything he said had to do with one of Rose's sisters, Barbara, who was in hospital now in St. John's after having tried to take her life. And she was recovering both physically and psychologically in hospital. And while she was there, she had told her husband, who was the guy who was in my apartment, that her father had been sexually molesting her since she could remember, and was still doing so right up to the time of her being married. In fact, still doing so after she was married. Um, and I was shocked. I was overwhelmed by that. But for some reason, maybe it was just a kind of defense mechanism.
Right.
It didn't occur to me what he was really telling. I gave him my condolences. I said, "Oh, that's awful. I mean, that's terrible." But for some reason, it didn't occur to me what he was saying. And he looked at me and he said, you don't realize, do you? And I said, I don't realize what? He said, well, what do you think the chances are that a man who would do what Barbara said was done to her would not also do that to his other three daughters? And then it hit me like a gust of wind, you know. He was telling me that in all likelihood, in fact, virtually impossible that it wouldn't be the case, that everything he had told me about Barbara and what had happened to her at the hands of her father had also happened to Rose, my wife, and to the other two sisters in the family. I'd met all of them by then. And that is the kind of news, in case there's anybody else out there who's ever had it, who know that that throws your life into chaos.
Mm.
Now, it didn't sink in right away that, you know, it would be a long time before Rose and I would figure out how to deal with this. It was, you're in the moment, your adrenaline is running. It's kind of like, you know, the best analogy I can make is that, you know, you're driving your car somewhere where there should be no other cars.
Mm.
And suddenly you're hit by another car and your car is sent spinning.
Mm.
And it keeps going that way. It felt like the car I was in kept spinning for years. That's how out of kilter my life had become. So that was the moment um, that you mentioned. And in a way, that's where the story, you know, the real story begins. It's not where it begins in the book, as you know.
Mm. Right. And one of the things that you talk about in the afterword is in the aftermath of that transformative meeting that you had with your brother-in-law, who you didn't know. And I imagine just would have been a shock just to have somebody barge into your house after coming in and immediately telling you who they were, who you'd never met. But I can't even imagine what the conversation would have been like with Rose immediately afterwards. Can you tell us a little bit about how that conversation went?
Yeah. So he left, and I was alone in the apartment. It was starting to get dark now. And I was expecting Rose any minute and trying to think how to talk to her about it, trying to think what you know, how I should talk to her about it. Also, a part of me was hoping against hope that maybe Barbara was the only one by some miracle, or maybe Rose was the only one who wasn't molested. All of these kinds of thoughts were going through my mind. Um, but when it comes to what kind of conversation we had, the answer really is, but when Rose got home and I spoke to her about what I, you know, had been told that afternoon, we had no conversation because Rose went completely silent. We were sitting in the kitchen, having a cup of tea, and she went completely silent. I asked her if it was true. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She didn't try to change the subject. She stared straight ahead, didn't say a word, didn't look at me. Um, I sort of rephrased the question, tried to, you know, uh, reassure her that, and this is reassuring her of something that I didn't know would be true, reassuring her that if it was true, you know, we would pull through it together somehow. But still, I got no answer at all from her. which made me think that it was true. Because if you can imagine being asked that if it wasn't true, how you would act, you would immediately deny it. You would be up in arms about why someone had said it was true, etc. So my worst fears were confirmed, but Rose was still not talking about it. And that went on. That, we talked about all kinds of other things, but that sort of taboo about what, the elephant in the room, um, that continued for weeks or months. Honestly, my memory of how things went is quite hazy over the next little while. The next thing I can actually remember doing, and I think it was probably a couple of weeks later, was going to the hospital to visit Barbara.
Mm. Mm. I want to ask you too, in the aftermath of all of this, how you mentioned that you were in the process of writing your second book, but this event, I think the way that you describe it in the book is that it's the dumping of the first draft of a new book in your lap when that night hit. And before I ask you about that composition history, when I was preparing today, I found a lecture that was published as an essay, and the name of the lecture is The Old Lost Land of Newfoundland, Family, Memory, Fiction, and Myth. In this lecture, you write, I never tell anyone, not even my wife or best friends or editors or publishers or agents, anything about my works in progress. I superstitiously think if I talk about it before it's done, a book will either come out wrong or evaporate altogether. I have never forgotten Robertson Davies' warning to would-be novelists that there are more novels have been talked about in Irish bars than have been written in Ireland. So I wonder, in light of that, whether this was a book that you did talk to Rose about, or whether this was something that you started to write in secret. Could you tell us a bit about how that composition process started?
Yeah, my first attempt at writing about it was very premature. I didn't know that, of course, but about a year later, we were still in St. John's. Things were not going well, kind of in every aspect of our lives, including the book, that would eventually turn out to be my second novel. Things got better and I was able to complete it. But I put aside that second novel and decided that I would try to write about Rose and her family. I thought about nonfiction at first, but structurally I couldn't find a way to make it work. So I went to fiction. It allowed me to imagine myself into places and into scenes and events that I was not privy to. So I was, able to use my imagination more freely. I wrote a draft, quite a long one, probably 600 or 700 pages, and I wrote it quite quickly, and reread it and realized that it read more like an effort to take revenge on Rose's behalf than it did like a novel. So I knew it wouldn't work. I knew there was no point in redrafting it. And because of my own kind of obsessive compulsive nature, I decided that the only way to move on in terms of my writing was to physically, literally get rid of this book.
Oh.
So I took the 600 or 700 pages, stuffed them into a garbage bag or a box or something. I know.
Oh my goodness. Oh, I can't even, that's a breathtaking thing for me to hear.
Yeah, I went outside. We were living close to Bonaventure Avenue in St. John's, and I went outside with this thing in my hands. I held it out at arm's length as if it was a bomb I had to defuse. Walked down the street looking for a place to get rid of it, And at the bottom of Bonaventure Avenue, and where Empire and Bonaventure intersect, there was a dumpster being used on a construction site. And I hove the book into that. And then, as soon as the book was in there, I climbed up the dumpster thinking, oh, I better get that back. You know, what have I done? What have I done? And I looked in and I saw the book. I said, oh, but by this time, all the pages were all spread out, but it was, you know, retrievable.
Right.
But I climbed down off the dumpster, turned my back, went back up to the apartment, sat in the apartment, and wondered for the first time in my life, how often are dumpsters emptied? Because I was wondering, how long am I going to have to wonder if
Right.
that book is still there and possibly still recoverable? Luckily for me, you know, for the next 24 hours, after the next 24 hours, I went back and looked into the dumpster and it was empty, and I realized the book was gone. And so I went back to the other book.
Wow.
I saw, can I respond to a question that just popped up on screen?
Yeah, you absolutely can.
Someone was wondering, someone said this was Rose's story to tell. Why is Wayne telling? It's a good question. It's a very fair question. And Rose, not right away, because we didn't talk about this right away, but eventually Rose asked me, kind of as if we had already spoken of it, when are you going to write about my side of the family? Because I had, in my second book, written about my side of the family. So she was wondering about her side of the family. And I said, well, do you mean what I think you mean? And she said, yes. She said, you know, I'm not a writer, you're a writer. This happened to you as well as to me, in a different way, of course. So I said, well, I tried once, you know, when you thought I was working on my second book, I was actually working on what we came to think of as the book. And I couldn't finish it, and I threw it away. She was kind of shocked to hear that and kind of surprised to hear it. But I told her that I would tell her the next time I tried again, which I did about 10 years later in Toronto. Almost the same scenario played itself out. I wrote a very long draft in a different way, hoping the tone was right, less sort of vengeful, hoping my own part in the story was now sufficiently distant that I could get some perspective on it and write it as a novel, as opposed to sort of some sort of revengeful track. I still didn't believe the book worked. I didn't like the tone. So I did exactly the same thing, except this time I walked out onto Yonge Street in Toronto, you know, people going by everywhere. And dumpsters are easier to come by on Yonge Street than they were in St. John's. So, however, I didn't choose one close to the house. I walked quite a long way from our house, threw the thing away, walked back to the house. And so that was draft number 2 disposed of. But I just wanted to tell the person who asked, and I appreciate the question, that, you know, this was not an appropriation of the story.
Right.
This is something that in a very real way was a kind of collaboration. Rose supplied me with a lot of the details about Cape Town. You know, I've been to Cape Town, but I don't know it as well as she does. I don't know South Africa as well as she does. I don't know the racial situation in South Africa, especially as it was back then, as well as she did. And that's a big part of the book, because the family in the book goes to South Africa, where everything kind of falls apart, where these accusations are in the book actually made. Yeah. So
Absolutely.
that's the answer to that question.
Yeah, and we're going to come back. I'd like to come back to South Africa in a little while too. Before we do, I wanted to now we've heard about two drafts that have found their way into the dumpster, and I do want to ask about how the third, which ultimately does become the book that we have here for it. But I want to return to something else that you'd said in the same essay that I'd remarked on. The subtitle of that lecture, Family, Memory, Fiction, and Myth, you write, there's a comma between family and memory, but there may as well not be, for the two are, in my mind, indistinguishable. Much of what we think we remember from our preteen years is supplied by our parents and mixes with what we really do remember to form more elaborate memories in which truth and fiction can be disentangled. And then near the end, and this is what I really want to tease this out, near the end of that lecture, you conclude, family, memory, myth, and fiction still persist together inextricably. And fiction is always and sometimes blessedly our story of last resort. And I really find it interesting too that you remark on the preteen years, because so many of the characters, the fact and fiction, from real life and in the fiction, the age of 13 is so powerful here. But I want to ask that question, that fiction as the last resort for the story. It seems like fiction became, after two drafts, not necessarily, I wonder whether last resort, but how did fiction unlock into the third version, which became the one that we have in our hands today?
Well, the best way to answer that is to talk about not so much nonfiction, but about the real life events. So after the revelations that my brother-in-law made to me that day, and now after a number of months had gone by, what happened was that Rose's parents returned to South Africa. Rose's father was an accounting professor at Memorial University. He and his wife returned to South Africa, I think because of, the revelations that have been made. Her sisters dispersed throughout not just Canada, but throughout the world. However, paradoxically, even though all of the sisters confirmed that these things had happened, they did not break off contact with their parents. They not only stayed in touch in terms of telephoning and writing, but in some occasions went to South Africa and stayed in the house in Cape Town with the parents, both of whom in my mind were in their different ways culpable in these incidents. And this kind of flabbergasted both Rose and me. So eventually, after contacting her sisters, Rose decided that if she and I were going to survive as a couple, we had to break things off with her family altogether. However, before we did that, we gave her parents, I forgot to mention this, we gave them one last chance, because we had asked them many times and they had denied that anything had happened. We gave them one last chance to tell us what had really happened. And we wanted to meet them. We hadn't met them at all after the revelations were made, but we actually wanted to look them in the eye. Rose especially wanted to do this. What she did, and what she does, what her counterpart does in the book, was instead of talking to her father, which she doubted she would be able to do, make the accusations, she wrote them down, sent them in a letter to him. And in the letter, aside from making the accusations, said, now let's meet somewhere in neutral ground, not in your house, not in our apartment, and let's hash this out and see if we can salvage something. So in a very dramatic, another afternoon, we met them in a motel room in St. John's that Rose and I had booked. And we were there first, and her parents showed up, and they were dressed really well, as if for a special occasion. And this bizarre conversation began. We stood on one side of the room, they stood on the other, and uh, Rose again put the question, what's going, what's true? Is what Barbara said true? I think it's true because it happened to me. What's going on? And he flatly denied having had anything to do with any of his daughters in the way that he'd been accused. Um, Eventually, I put the question to him, and that's when the tone of the meeting changed.
Mm.
Then he pointed at me and told me literally to shut up because I was not a member of the family. I had nothing to do with it. It wasn't my business. And again, I was flabbergasted. I said, well, I'm married to your daughter. You might not like it, but I am.
Right.
And he started to lose his temper. And finally, it was almost like one of these sort of Perry Mason moments. I hate to make that kind of what might sound like a frivolous analogy, but it was as if he was on the witness stand and he lost his wits because he said, okay, so what? So I did. He said, they're my daughters.
Wow.
I can do whatever I want with them. And I honestly almost fell to the floor. Then I thought about a physical confrontation. And I think Rose's mother saw that and decided that it was probably time to end that meeting and leave. So that they left, and we didn't see them for the next about 15 years, I guess, when there was one more meeting in Toronto, and then after that, we didn't see them ever again. So if I had tried to write the book as it happened, as events happened, there would have been this enormous interval
Right.
when all of the characters in the book would have been elsewhere in the world while Rose and I were somewhere else. And there would have been no contact. There would have been no events taking place between us and them. It would have been the story, basically, of how Rose and I came to adjust to deal with what was happening. And there'd be a story there, but it wouldn't. You'd be surprised how much of it is just silence,
Right.
and a coming to terms with silence, and an acceptance of silence, and a respect of silence. So that's how I decided to write the work in fiction. But in this fiction, and I have no compunction about saying this, in this fiction, there are many truths and many actual scenes that took place. And there are many other things that I was told by other people that are in there, and sometimes cast in a different way, in a different kind of scene. Uh, Things, family, memory, myth, especially myth was important because of the many versions and excuses that her father came up with to try to disprove the accusations that had been made against him. And the book took shape in my mind in that kind of mythical way. So in the book itself, I have the character that's the counterpart of Rose's father,
Mm-hmm.
and make up a bedtime story that he calls the Ballad of Hans van Hout.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a kind of thing he recites to the girls from memory at bedtime. And it's a long, you only see little pieces of it at a time. but it's a long kind of poem of self-justification.
Yeah.
It has a kind of almost Dr. Seuss kind of sing-song rhythm. And in it, he describes, coming to South Africa, meeting his wife, having these daughters, having his colleagues turn on him because of various lies that he tells, and as it now turns out, because of various things that he did to some of their daughters. But that's not said in the book until later in the book. So that's one of the things I did, and then to counter that, Rachel, who is Rose's counterpart in the book, writes what she calls the Aureliad, which kind of like the Iliad. It's just in a fun way. She describes it kind of like the Iliad, but it's literally an epic poem, also portioned out throughout the book, in which she tries to write herself out of the psychosis that she sometimes goes into because of the psychiatric effect of the shock to her psyche, her emotions. Um, she's in a dissociative state as she's writing this poem, but it is, it is the brain's way of trying to come to terms with what happened and trying to write your way out of the hold that the other poem and the other events in her life still have on her years later.
Mm. One of the things that I find so compelling about the way that you've done this, the literary devices that you use to come in, as you'd mentioned, with that confrontation with your wife's father, the counterpart of Hans, is the way in which you have to write from the perspective of this psychopathy, of this position that is so difficult to think the way in. And the ballad itself, I think it's iambic tetrameter, is that with an
Right.
and,
Yeah.
and for people who, and the iamb or the iambic has an unstressed and then a stressed
Right.
part of the unit. So think of beyond is the way in which a unit of the iambic would work. And what I associate as a student of literature on this is old epics, that one of the ways in which you remember oral history poems, the way you transmit them is to have these very heavily rhythmic poems. And
Yeah.
it works that way in the sense that, as you've said, it's an indoctrination poem. It's a way of almost bringing them in. So this iambic tetrameter is kind of, as it's continually recited to the girls, is giving them this very mythic story of the family. And then the Aureliad has a way of, as you say, countering, where it breaks, it does have rhyme and rhythm in, but it breaks into a more lyrical quality. How did you come up with, maybe we could take it one part at a time. How did you come up with this ballad structure as a way to get into the head or to represent such a difficult character?
Yeah, the fictional character, as you say, is undoubtedly, my first notion was sociopath, but I eventually, and since The Mystery of Right and Wrong is published, have come to realize that it's psychopathy. He was definitely a psychopath. There may be reasons for him having become one. It depends on how you look at these things. But I wanted to write about him, but I didn't. It all kind of went back to, how do I avoid this sort of prosaic need to take revenge,
Right. Right.
And I thought, it finally occurred to me, use another genre, use poetry.
Mm.
It's not that this will elevate the subject in the sense of making it noble or, more palatable, but it will move you away from this path that you've been on in both drafts that were discarded and in your own mind. And it will make the story take on a mythological or mythic dimension that it might not otherwise have.
Right.
Now I wondered to myself, okay, how good should his poetry be? Given who he is,
Right. Right.
how good should his poetry be? And so I had a very practical problem, and that was how to write kind of sing-song poetry, but also convey the cleverness with which he was using language to indoctrinate his daughters. And so I worked a lot on it. I write everything longhand. I worked a lot on, what his use of language should be. A lot of alliteration.
Mm.
There's that iambic tetrametric kind of sing-song way that facilitates memorizing things. And then make sure the reader knows that these verses are repeated to them thousands of times over the years, because the ballad and the ballad room where they go to hear the ballad, this goes on for, until the girls leave home.
Mm-hmm.
So by the time they leave home, this has been imprinted on their brain. So that allowed me to give him a voice that would not alienate the reader right away, like I was inside the head of a psychopath, but would also allow the reader to see the disintegration of this masquerade that the ballad is.
Yeah.
It's full of pretense about how he is more sinned against than sinning, about how he's a victim and that he was victimized and his colleagues did this and that. But he tells it all in a way that has a kind of, it's almost entertaining.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
A very beguiling form of entertainment. And so that's how I came up with that. The counter to that was even more difficult, because the same question occurred to me. How good should the poetry of an emotionally and psychologically marred 22-year-old woman be? And I decided to go back to one of the very few poems I'd ever written in my life, and I wrote it when I was 21.
Wow.
And we needed rent at the time, Rose and I, and there was this arts and letters competition in Newfoundland, and because we had measured out how much money we need to get to a certain point, and there was a $300 prize for best poem, and there was $300 prize for best short story, et cetera, pretty much every genre you could think of. So we were desperate for money, so I entered in every category. The category I came up winning in was poetry, to my absolute astonishment.
Wow.
Because I thought of myself as a prose writer. So I won this $300. And I kind of, in later years, just, say 4 or 5 years later, thought of it as a not very good poem. It was a very long poem. That's an interesting thing, because Rachel's poem was very long as well, but it's a very long poem. But, I went back to it, 30 years later, and it actually wasn't bad, especially if I kept in mind that I was 21 years old when I wrote it.
Mm.
And that poem didn't use iambic tetrameter, but it used iambic pentameter,
Right.
which is blank verse, which is Shakespeare's meter. So I said, well, maybe give that a try, except realize that Hans's ballad is so imprinted on Rachel's mind that she probably will use his meter, but she will get out of it from time to time as well, and kind of write prose that has that meter embedded in it. And it was difficult to do until if you practice enough, you get the voice. And once I got the voice, Rachel's poetry just began to cascade down the pages of this notebook. And I really, really, more than with any other character I've ever written, with the possible exception of Sheila Fielding from the Colony of Unrequited Dreams, I really, really entered into the mind of my character. And to the point where when I finished writing at night, I would try to read or watch TV or listen to music, and my thoughts would play themselves out in rhyme.
Wow.
It would be rhyming iambic tetrameter. I'd fall into this rhyme just thinking. I'd sometimes fall into rhyme talking on the telephone. This was how so absolutely ingrained with this voice I was. So that was the two things. One character trying to write her way out of psychosis, another character essentially causing this psychosis or aggravating it with this ballad that he writes, both to indoctrinate the girls into the idea that what he's doing to them is not wrong, that it's normal, and that it's a secret that they must keep inside the house, inside the family, must never go outside. And self-justification for how his life has turned out, self-justification for things he may or may not have done during the war, when he claims that he fought with the Dutch underground, running messages as a teenager. That's something that Rose's father in real life claimed to have done as well, but which after investigation turned out to be untrue. And not to spoil the book for people who have not yet read it, but not only untrue, but the things he actually was doing were a far cry from helping the resistance. Let's just put it that way.
Right. And one of the things that I find interesting about the ballad too is that the apologia, the perverse apologia, continues to get more sophisticated as it goes. And with Rachel, it's interesting, the Aureliad, I find actually the Odyssey is a great comparator, because you think of the Odyssey of Odysseus returning with his men after the Trojan War, it's a 10-year journey. And the experience of Rachel begins when she's 13 and 22, 23. It's this homecoming. She's trying to return from this place. And many people speculate, of course, with the Odyssey, that these are metaphorical or fantasy experiences that Odysseus goes through. But one of the things too that you see in that is the encountering of obstacles and creatures along the way, like Scylla and Charybdis. And in the ballad, we have Claus van Snout. And I wondered if you could tell us about Claus in terms of his role in these devices that you've placed in the book.
And well, this mythical sort of dragon-like creature was first invented by Hans in response to, this is what's said in the ballad, in response to the girl saying, "Daddy, tell us a scary story."
Right.
So he tells them about this child-eating dragon, tells this in rhyme, and this takes hold of their imaginations. Eventually, Rachel realizes that this mythical character is actually a personification of her father, which maybe he doesn't realize. But he has mythologized himself into this, almost Greek or Roman, Hydra figure, three-headed hydras. And so Rachel incorporates him into the poem, and the slaying of this dragon, shall we say, is a metaphor for what she has to do to emerge from the psychosis that often overcomes her, and be able to carry on, um, not forgetting what happened to her, and not stopping writing the Aurelia, but writing it in a different way, writing it, and we don't know how she goes on to write it. We just know that she doesn't stop by the end of the book. It's hard to describe everything about it without mentioning that Anne Frank plays an enormous role in the book, because in real life, there was in Amsterdam, where Rose's father claimed to have been a member of the resistance. Anne Frank's house was nearby where he claimed to live, and he claimed to have gone past there every day while he was putting messages under cobblestones for the Dutch resistance. What he was actually doing, again, I won't go into. So there is an event that happens in Rachel's childhood when, as you say, she's just a teenager, a young, very young teenager, that has to do in a way with Anne Frank. And it's something that haunts Rachel. It's something that her sisters don't have to deal with because they didn't witness what she witnessed, and don't carry with them a sense of guilt, the same sense of guilt about the same thing as she does. So in the Aurelia, in the poem, Anne Frank and Margot Frank are actually in this place called the Yellow Wood. This is where the Aurelia takes place.
Yeah.
Three girls, aside from Rachel, inhabit this world. One is Anne Frank, one is Margot Frank, and one is a girl that Rachel refers to as my shadow she. And the reader doesn't know who that is. That's a mystery. That's one of the mysteries of right and wrong. Who is that girl? Why is she in Rachel's poem? Why is she so important? And how will this world play itself out by the end of the book? Will these three girls, two of them historical, one of them reader doesn't know, will they approach Rachel? Will they simply be there in this world, and she will go on and comment on them, but never actually engage with them?
Yeah, I find the world of Aurelia just so fascinating. And I actually do want to ask you how you constructed it, that sepia tinted yellow woods, the color yellow in terms of how it's constructed. And you give us a bit of a hint in the afterword where you mentioned Kay Redfield Jameson as somebody that was really helpful to you. And I wondered if I could ask you how you went about constructing Rachel's experience, almost as a survivor of trauma, a writer. How did you create Aurelia in this way?
Well, one of the things that I do say in the afterword is that, I have my own mental illness that first sort of just came upon me when I was about 13 or 14 years old. Then it went away, and then it returned with a vengeance when I was about 23. So I had some notion of dissociation myself, because my own illness, obsessive compulsive disorder, sometimes got, before I got treatment for it, sometimes got so severe that I really was in a dissociative state. So I knew what that was like. But I'd read these books by Kay Redfield Jameson, who is the head of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. Series of books that she wrote about being a manic depressive, which is not the same as obsessive compulsive, but has many overlaps. And in it, she tries to write about the connection between madness and creativity. Why is it that so many artists also suffered from mental illness? Did their art drive them crazy, or did their so-called craziness allow them to be artists? Uh, that question fascinated me, and she herself is an artist, a writer, beautiful, brilliant writer, and extremely well read, especially in mythology and all kinds of other things. So she has one book called Touched by Fire,
Mm.
um, that is about, it's from a quote by Oliver Wendell Holmes. Uh, in our youths, our hearts were touched by fire. He's talking about the American Civil War. Um, she uses that quote to try to describe to the reader what the manic part of manic depression is like, how you can't stop writing. You're hypergraphic, which I am. When your illness is acting up, you're hypergraphic, and you write and write and write until you're writing gibberish, or until you keep on reviewing what you've written and say to yourself, could that sentence be better? Could I make that better? And you get stuck on one sentence, and you might be stuck in it for hours, or if you're very unlucky, days. Um, so one of the things that Kay Redfield Jameson says in her book is that many historical figures, artists whose biographies are well known, reported that many, who had a mental illness, reported that when they were psychotic, meaning seeing and hearing things that weren't there, the world took on a different color.
Mm.
Joan of Arc is one of the most famous instances of this. She's now largely thought to have been schizophrenic. And when she was in a schizophrenic state, she would see little miniature people and animals in her hand that were very brightly, luridly colored, blue, red, yellow, green. And all around her, the world was either cerulean blue or sort of blood red. And that, for whatever reason, psychiatrists don't know, that is a frequent thing with people who have a mental illness. So I decided that this world should have a single color. It should be monochromatic. And I tried to think, what would the right color be? And I went through all the colors and thought of what they represented, in literature. Green represents jealousy because of Shakespeare, the monster, the green-eyed monster, jealousy. Then I thought of, others, and I thought, red, that's anger. Then I thought yellow. Oh, yellow represents cowardice, and I thought, yep, that's it, because that's how she was indoctrinated, by someone whose motive was cowardice,
Mm.
and in a refusal to own up to any of the things he'd done, a refusal to stop doing the things he was doing. And so the yellow wood becomes the setting for the Aureliad and for Rachel's perception when she is psychotic, whether she's writing or not.
Mm. And I've got a couple of more questions that I'm going to ask Wayne, but as we're doing this, I'd encourage everybody to write your questions into the Q&A and chat, and we'll try to bring them in as best we can into the discussion. So just a reminder there. One of the things that I also admire about this book is your courage to counter on, to the courage that you have to disclose your experience of hyperlexia and hypergraphia, which I actually didn't know until I read this book, as manifestations or expressions of OCD. I imagine you didn't necessarily have to do that. You could have given her your experience without confessing that in the book. Why did you decide that this was an important thing to reveal about you in the book?
Partly because of what I just said, which, it was almost, I wanted the reader to know that I had a real life experience of, I mean, I shouldn't sugarcoat it, madness.
Mm.
I'm not mad all the time, but severe obsessive compulsiveness, if untreated, you do enter a state of madness. Also, however, um, while I was writing the book, but before I started writing the poetry, I thought to myself, um, even though I've got their permission, even though in some cases I've got their encouragement,
Mm.
not just in Rose's, but in the case of a couple of other of her sisters as well, um, I'm telling things about them, but I haven't in the book found a way to tell things about me, because if the character of Wade was um, psychotic and Rachel was psychotic, there'd be no touchstone in the book, no person who was sort of quotation marks ordinary.
Mm.
Also, though, it occurred to me that it would almost be an act of solidarity with the people who inspired the book,
Yeah.
if I confess to having illnesses that were similar to theirs. However, I had a sort of selfish kind of thing in mind as well, which is that I had been hiding my obsessive compulsiveness for decades, going out of my way to give a rational explanation for counting things and keeping track of things, because hyperlexia and hypergraphia are not the only symptoms of OCD.
Mhm.
Anyone who has OCD generally has it right across the board. I'm a writer, and so OCD generally goes after whatever is most dear to you. And so,
Mm.
or one of the things that's most dear to me. And so that in fact did happen. But anxiety and depression are also part of OCD. And so it was almost an act of solidarity to say, hey, uh, I'll come out now. But also I hoped it would be a huge relief that I would no longer have to expend so much physical and psychic energy hiding from the world. And I still don't know, enough time hasn't gone by. I don't feel that much different yet. So I don't know how in the long run it's going to affect me. I do know that when I started writing the book, one of my worries was that writing about madness might itself cause me to descend into it, because I kind of naturally have that tendency. I have to be treated for it. I see a therapist, I take medication, and I wondered how dealing with this kind of stuff head on, which I do in the book many times, I wondered how that would affect me. Um, and that, I think, to just double back for a second, that I think also to some degree explains the poetry,
Mhm.
because it's a kind of way of, it's a kind of form of dissociation. Most people don't speak in poetry, and they don't start to get it stuck in their heads the way I did. And so it kind of allowed me to say things um, that didn't make me feel as bad as they might have had I been writing in prose.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's a question in the chat that I think it's a good time to maybe throw this in, because we have talked about Hans, but we haven't talked about Hans's wife, which actually I won't reveal, because this does become a big part of the conundrum of how to think through Hans's wife, my, which is an interesting way to phrase, and Mary as the counterpart. The question is, how do we account for the wives of men like Rose's dad who would stay with their husbands while knowing what they have done? How did you grapple with that question when you were composing the book?
Oh, it was in a way, one of the toughest parts of the book. I think, I think it happens gradually. I think in most cases, except in a sort of Paul Bernardo scenario, in most cases, the woman meets the man and marries the man before she knows who and what he really is, and is actually in love, uh, probably wants to have kids, has a great deal of emotional investment, um, great deal of practical investment. And I think little by little by little, as these women learn what's going on, they rationalize to themselves that although it hurts other girls and women, it won't hurt my girls and women, because otherwise their lives are actually very good. They're the daughters of a professor. They're very well known in the community. They're highly regarded and highly respected in the community.
Mm.
So I think I think there's a kind of process of attrition by which their moral compass kind of disintegrates, and they become wrapped up in presenting a face to the world that corresponds with what they would like to be as opposed to what they are. And they habituate in just the way, they are manipulated exactly the way that their daughters are. And they become part of the pathology of a household. And they wind up telling the girls how to keep this a secret without actually overtly talking about it. So they will simply say something like, as she does in the book, anything that happens in this house, anything that's said in this house, stays in this house. And it's like that in houses everywhere, she says. We're no different. Every house is like this. And as the years go on, these things, I think, become more and more deeply ingrained. The self-delusion becomes more powerful, up to the point where they literally become enablers. They make up alibis for, where was my husband at a particular time? Could he have done this? Why are the daughters saying this? Oh, well, they're saying this because they're spoiled brats, because they don't know how hard life really is, and they're trying to get back at their dad, taking revenge, et cetera, et cetera. And, none of it is true. And they're not even sure, just as the real life person said, they're not even sure that any man ever has done these kinds of things. It's just a notion put in their heads by psychotherapists. How all that begins, if there are women who marry men like that and have the courage to out them, I suspect there are, but I don't know of any. It's a very difficult thing because it's such an incredible bond, a mother-daughter bond, and not to honor it is such a betrayal. And it's hard to write that and be sympathetic to the character. And I always want to some degree be sympathetic or empathetic to a character, because I really see no point in writing about people just so that I can lay blame.
Mm,
I want to know what makes them tick.
mhm,
The book, sometimes in the book, the question comes up from Wade's point of view. That's sort of my character. Um, is there such a thing as free will? You know, let's say hypothetically that Hans was abused when he was a child. If he was, and subsequently went on to abuse his daughters, is he to blame? Could he have decided, in spite of how he was treated, not to mimic his own parents? What about his experience in the war? He was, 6 years in a city that was occupied by Nazis. What would that be like? What effect would that have on your psyche, on your worldview? How how ingratiating might it make you? Because that's how a lot of people survived with the Nazis, was to ingratiate themselves with them. And the Nazis loved that,
mm.
because, Nazism is essentially a love of power. Not Nazism, the slogan of them essentially is might is right. If you are strong enough to do something, you have a moral right to do it. That's what the Nazis believed. They based themselves on this whole philosophy that they turned inside out, uh, and came up with this idea that if you're strong enough, if you're stronger than someone else, you can lord it over them in any way you want. Um,
That's a great stitch, and actually, it makes me think of something that the book is broken up into sections that have geographic distinctions. So St. John's, and then we go to South Africa, to Amsterdam, to St. John's. And one of the things I said at the beginning is I'd come back to South Africa, and I do want to on this question of power. When Wade arrives to South Africa, coming from Canada, he's struck by apartheid treatment of Black citizens of South Africa. He's struck by the difference of Canadian society to apartheid. And I think it might be Bethany that says, or it might be Rachel too, who rebukes and says, you'd be surprised how fast you can acclimatize to this. And
yeah,
it's about power. And I'm wondering, when you wrote, because there's so much to talk about this in book, it's so rich, but the power dynamic that's happening in South Africa, it seems to me that there's a relationship here to gender-based violence, that there's a question of power that's running through, and how people abuse and misuse power, and how we accept that abuse of power. Was that something that you had in mind of how to interrogate power relationships?
yeah. I see there being a connection between what are the sort of three, I don't know if themes is exactly the right word, but the three kind of uh, sort of social crimes of the book. Sexual abuse, uh, racism, and you know, literal violence. Um, War, um, and genocide comes up in the book because of the Holocaust.
Mm.
Um, Nadine Gordimer, a South African writer, um, once said to my editor was there she was a journalist at the time, and she was in South Africa, in Johannesburg, to interview her. And one of the first things that Nadine Gordimer said to my editor, Ann Collins, at Random House, was, "You will be amazed at what this country does to you,
Mm.
whether you're white or black. Now, it will do different things depending on which you are." But she said, "You will be surprised how quickly everything will come to seem normal. You will be surprised at how genteel the racism is. You'll be surprised at how liberal people who have black servants and make them sleep in a shed behind the house, how magnanimous they think they are. And she said one way, she described an instance where her father, Nadine Gordimer's father, was ill, and he had had a heart attack, and she had been told this, and she rushed to the hospital in Johannesburg. And when she got into the hospital room where her father was, there was a Black doctor. And, you know, Nadine Gordimer won the Nobel Prize for Literature. She is what most people would think of as being, you know, very liberal, very left-wing, very enlightened, if you're left-wing. But when she saw this Black doctor, her first impulse was to say, move away, I want a real doctor. And she actually said something to the doctor, like, where's the doctor who's taking care of my father? And he left and never came back. And another doctor took over. And, you know, she said that is what it was like. And when I went to South Africa, I was barely off the plane. We come in from the airport. We were in Cape Town, decided to go for a run along the seawall in Cape Town. And this is depicted in the book. We go running, there's a high hedge on one side, so you can't see what's around the turn. We round this turn, and there in the middle of the path, or just to the right of it, are two people, a Black woman, very big Black woman, and a very thin Black man. And they're fighting, and they're fighting to the death. They both have screwdrivers, and they're stabbing at each other. We're shocked and, you know, completely horrified. Before we can even do more than say stop to them, an armored vehicle pulls up behind us. The guys in it, who are, you know, white, they're soldiers. They tell us to get out of the way, point the guns at us, actually, tell us to get out of the way. They pick up the two Black people who by now are lying on the ground, throw them in the back of this vehicle, and it drives away. But one of them leaves a beret on the ground beside the blood that's on the grass and beside the screwdrivers that are still there. So he comes running back in his army boots, big smile on his face when he sees us, kind of winks at us, picks up the screwdrivers, puts on his beret, throws the screwdrivers into Cape Town Harbor, and then runs back to the armored vehicle. And I remember thinking, and I write it in the book because I put it in my notebook, as I knew I would write about it someday. I remember thinking how young he was. My guess would be 19, how sort of apple-cheeked and normal he looked. How I had no doubt how inexperienced with anything except South Africa he was. And how it never occurred to him to think that we might need reassurance or to say something to us. It was just almost a lark, an adventure. Being served by Black servants, I could not get used to it. I always talked to them and was always told by them that if I continued to do that, I would get them into trouble. And I found it so difficult not to speak to them. I was told in a restaurant that whatever I did, I must not leave money on the table when I was going, because if it was found out by the white owners of the restaurant that I had left a tip, they would be fired instant. So you couldn't rebel, you couldn't put up a even personal resistance, because if you did, you would do more harm than good. And so imagine you're born into that culture. And by the time you're 25, 30, 35, 40, you have lost the ability to see things any other way except to say, this is perfectly normal. we're treating them properly. They do not have the wherewithal to fend for themselves, so we must care for them until they do have that wherewithal. But we never intend to give it to them. Often white people in South Africa will say to you, we'll talk about what should we do if something happens? And what they're referring to, or used to refer to, was a revolution by the blacks and blacks taking control. And my wife's mother once asked their gardener, if there was an uprising, you wouldn't kill us, would you? And he says, no, madam, I wouldn't. I would get my black friend who next door to kill you, and I would kill his people. It's a strange, sometimes nightmarish country, such a beautiful country, and yet its history and its culture, its white culture for the most part, is so awful. That, all of those things might explain why Myra is the way she is in the book.
Right. One of the questions in the Q&A, you've answered the second part of it, but the first one, are your parents-in-law still alive? And you established that they have passed away, which was one of the conditions for writing this book. But it makes me think of another question, because I'm mindful of time, and I do want to ask you this before I don't have a chance, which is whether in the aftermath of all of this, whether just as power has the ability to oppress and to control people, it also has the ability to liberate, and it has the ability to reconfigure things. And I wonder whether the telling of this story and the family that, as I understand it, was estranged for quite some time, whether now that there's a reconstruction taking place, or a recovery and a rebuilding, how is your family, your wife's family, doing right now in the wake of everything?
Quite well. My book is not going to erase what was done to them. Mm-hmm. I'm grateful, I'm glad that they kind of looked forward to the book, and to the best of my knowledge, given what they've told me, none of none of their problems have been aggravated by it. One of them has went so far as to say, Barbara did, that I had found a way to write about these things, horrible things, without making the reading of the book seem horrible. Mm. And that was, my problem all along, was how do you make a book about bad things, about unpleasant things? How do you make the reading not unpleasant? And all of the sisters have said, that they find the book to be irresistible, not in the sense of, oh, I couldn't put it down, but, they have put it down, but I have felt a compulsion to go back to it. And I've heard this from other people as well, not just the sisters. I actually heard this afternoon from the director of Anne Frank House in Amsterdam, who wrote me to say that she quite loved the book, especially the Anne Frank parts of the book. But she also said, she said it's 555 pages long. And she said, I would put it aside to take a break, but I found I couldn't take a break. I would go back because I was compelled to go back to the book. Mm. And she said, I finished the book a couple of months ago, and she said it's still in my head, and not in a bad way. And I think from what I've heard, it's early days. It's only a couple of months since the book came out, but as far as I can tell, this is how the sisters are reacting to it. Now, whether or not they're telling me everything they think, I have no way of knowing. but I can only tell you what they're telling me.
Right. We have a question in the chat. Wayne mentioned being in Fielding's head just as he was in Rachel's. Was it hard to let these women go? I asked because Fielding was with us through 3 books.
I can't speak for other writers, but I never let my characters go, or maybe I should put it the other way around. They never let me go. I all the way back to my first book, The Story of Bobby O'Malley. I think through the eyes of my characters many times and ask myself, what would Bobby have thought of that? And there are points of intersection in the books, thematically, even in terms of types of characters that are similar. It is, however, there is a time when you have to push on and write another book and create more characters. What I would liken it to, the analogy that I use, is that after you write a book and you've finished promoting it and the book has been out for, say, 6 or 8 months, and this is not my case because I'm already writing another book, but there comes a time when it's kind of like the way a snake sheds its skin, does that, every year. It has to, so that the new skin will be stronger. You have to shed the skin of the old book before you can move on to the next book. And that's easier for some people than it is for others. I literally can't stop writing. And I've managed to channel that into being a novelist, luckily, and knock on wood, I should say, so far I've been able to do that. A lot of people find they have to wait a year, 2 years before they start a book again, for the very reason that their characters are still talking, in their heads, and they're still seeing the world through their characters' eyes. I don't know if that's a blessing or a curse, but I don't have that, either one.
This book has been in gestation for 30 years. So it's been a part of you for such a long time. How does it feel now that this book is out in the world? It must be different than the release. Now, of course, all your books are an important experience, but there must be something about the book, the foundational book, being out in the world. Has it been a source of relief? Have you had a feeling that's unique to this experience?
I think I'm probably going to, but I think it's still a little too soon. I am writing a new book, but I find myself, as I'm writing the new book, sometimes drifting off into thinking about the previous book, into, I've gotten an enormous amount of response privately about this book. Emails, letters, Facebook messages, private Facebook messages, public Facebook messages, all sorts of things. And I'm still doing events like this. And so it's difficult just yet to get a sense of perspective on what this book will mean to me in the long run. What will I have a sense of release or relief? Or, will I not? Will my, will my worst fear come true, and my OCD will ultimately be aggravated? I don't think that's the case. I think that would have happened while I was writing the book, if it was going to happen at all. But if you ask me this question a year from now, I'd probably have a better answer.
Well, we have people in the chat that are coming to us from, I saw someone from Yellowknife all the way to Corner Brook, Newfoundland, to Vancouver, and everywhere in between, and even beyond Canada. So clearly this book and your writing has touched so many people in Canada. We've had the audience wrapped in for the entire evening. I thank you so much for joining us at the Words Festival. I personally found this just an incredibly powerful book. I read it in 2 sittings. And I think I stayed all the way through the night reading the book because I couldn't put it down. It was just a breathtakingly powerful book. And I encourage everybody out there to get a copy of Wayne's new book. It is absolutely evocative, powerful. I can't recommend it enough. Wayne Johnston, thank you so much for coming to the Words Festival. Thank you all who tuned in from near and far to join us. This has been just such an extraordinary evening. I really thank you for being with us.
I do too. Thanks, everyone.
Have a good night, everyone. Thank you very much.